This is your story. This is my story. But most of all, this is the greatest story ever told. This is God's story. In the days when judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, so a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi. The names of their 2 sons was Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah. They went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, and one was named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. When Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home," but Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. May the Lord deal with me, be it severely, and death separates you and me.
Well, good morning, everyone. So someone asked me earlier, last week I started off with the story of that I was going to be driving the youth to camp and to pray for me because I didn't know how that was going to go. So anyone asked me if it was exciting? Not particularly. There were like 4 students in 4 rows in the van, so I naturally assumed that they would each take 1 row and probably just lay down and sleep through the whole thing. No, they put 3 in the back row, 1 in the row in front of them. They all gathered as far away from Jen and I as possible. And then they stayed on their phones mostly, but they were laughing and talking. It was fun. They played games. What was it, like headbands where you put like a person on your head? Is it called headbands on the phone? I don't know. Okay. And they have like a celebrity, and I'm like, as I could hear their clues, I was like, these kids are young. They do not know these celebrities at all. Like, I could have totally wiped the floor with them, but A challenge. So, we are, of course, doing the story, which is a long-term curriculum. It's 31 weeks, but it is to go through the entire Bible. From the first pages of Genesis to the very end of Revelation. And it's supposed to tell the story. And this story of the Bible, this story of God's redemption of human beings, is really important because once we understand the story, all the little stories in the Bible start to make more sense. And so one of the distinctions we've kind of mentioned at the beginning, and I want to reiterate today, is the difference in the big story, which is a story of God losing human beings in the garden and then working out through the pages of history a redemption plan to bring them home. Through his Christ, he was able to save them and provide that way. And then ultimately, at the very end of time, he will bring them back in a complete material sense to him. That is the big story. But scattered throughout the big story are the smaller stories. The stories of people like King David and people like Moses and people like Jesus and Paul and Peter and all of these people. Those are the little stories, and how their little stories fit into the big story is often kind of what we discover through all of this. But today, I think, is a little bit different. The little story we're talking about is Ruth. And in a lot of ways, really the big story almost disappears for a moment. It is connected, but not till the very, very end. For this book, the little story comes to the forefront. And the life of this woman, Ruth, is fascinating. And so I'm really excited to talk about Ruth. It's really an interesting story, and I hope that you get something out of this. But Ruth is an interesting and fascinating book. Ruth, her story is, for one thing, tragic. Deaths in her family leave her to be alone in a strange land. It makes it so that her life is not easy, and the life of others in the story is not easy. And so, in many ways, we can relate to the idea of things that didn't go quite right. Her life is imperfect. It's full of questionable decisions. Nothing goes like the set-out plan of life where you're supposed to, go to college, meet someone, get married, have your 2.5 kids and your white picket fence. It just doesn't go according to plan at all. And I think we can relate to her perhaps in that. I think Ruth is particularly vulnerable at times. There's a real risk of being destitute, and she has to go to people and ask for help, which she may have never wanted to do. I think that her life is messy and sad at times. And in the end, her small story teaches us that it can be full of hope, that even messy lives can have happy endings. When it really comes to the end, that small story does connect to the larger story in an unexpected way. Ruth's is a messy life, but it's one that teaches us that if your life is messy, that's okay. You can connect to the big story too. So let's get started. Let's just go to the very beginning, Ruth chapter 1 and verse 1, and let's see kind of how this kicks off. First of all, it says, in the days of what? The judges. Now, the judges we talked about were the people who ruled right after Joshua and before the kings came along. Judges are what we talked about last week. It was a sad time in history. And the reason that Ruth exists right after, or the book is placed right after the book of Judges, is because probably of this verse. It is set in the time of the judges. And so chronologically, it makes sense to break up the big story and put Ruth's little story, just 4 chapters, here, tied to the judges. In the days of the judges, there was a famine in the land. And so a man from, and what city is that? Bethlehem. Is that a famous city in the Bible? Yeah. Jesus was born there. And interestingly, so was King David. But we'll get to that. Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and his 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. So the setting for this is a famine has broken out, and these Israelites have to go live somewhere else in another country in order to survive. And so they end up in Moab, one of their neighbors and honestly one of their enemies. And so it's a strange thing to have to go away from their homeland to another place, but this is their unfortunate destiny. Let's go to verse 2. The man's name, the Israelite, was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi. By the way, the story begins and ends not with Ruth, but Naomi. She is very, very important. And so we will go back and forth talking about her and Ruth. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, and they were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Israelites living in a foreign country were given their names, Elimelech being the man, Naomi the woman. The kids' names are there, but honestly, you don't need to remember them very long. Now, the reason being that tragedy strikes. So, first of all, the man, Elimelech, dies first in Moab, We're not given the story of how, we're not given the why, we don't know. But unfortunately, Naomi has it hard. She has to raise these two boys by herself. And this is a difficult thing. It's not easy in our world to raise children by yourself, let alone hers. And even more than that, they're not near their family, but they are far away in a different place. And so she raises up her two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. And unfortunately, the story takes another tragic turn. And both of her sons die. But before they die, they've gone on to marry Moabite women, which, by the way, according to the traditions of the time, probably questionable. An Israelite marrying a Moabite, but I don't know that they had very many options. None of this is perfect, okay? And so they marry these Moabite women, but then they go on to die, which leaves Naomi, one, in a very tragic situation. She now has no husband, she has no sons, and she lives far away from home. She is truly at risk of being absolutely destitute. But interestingly, she also has these two daughters-in-law, these two Moabite women. And they now have a decision to make. And so these three women, actually their names are Naomi and then Orpah and Ruth. Their fate is not good. None of them in this world, in this day and age, have many options. They can't own property, and things are going to be really difficult. And so Naomi gathers her two daughters-in-law and comes together and gives them a little speech about what they need to do at this point in life. Going down to verse 8, then Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home." That is, you don't have anything now. Go back to your mother's home. You may still have a chance. May the Lord show you kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband. Unfortunately, it's a society in which without a husband, there is really no way to survive. So go home, go back to your families, and try again. Start over. You're still young enough to do so. But Naomi's situation is different. But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands?" Verse 12, "Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters," and I love this line, is fascinating. "It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." A couple things I want you to notice. Number one, she talks about she can't have any more sons for them to marry. That kind of seems a strange thing to say. Well, if you know a little bit about the Old Testament, there's something that is often called the Levirate duty. And it was a concept that was commanded at times in the Old Testament that if a son were to die without having children, there was a way of trying to keep the family line going. And the tradition was that the brother or the brother would then marry her and have children to keep on his brother's line. That was called the Levirate duty. It was a very Old Testament way of thinking, but it was something that was very common. And here, in this case, there is no brother to do it. Both brothers died at the same time, apparently. And so the genealogy cannot be saved, or so it seems. That is why she says about the sons. The other thing to notice is that Naomi is not in a good headspace. You know what I mean? She says, "It is more bitter for me than it is for you. You are young, you have a chance. Someone might still marry you, but me? I don't think so." She says it's bitter. She even says that the Lord's hand has turned against me. Any of you ever had a tough break in life? Maybe even a couple of them. Now, some of us, when we had our tough breaks, had enough time that we felt we could redeem it, and some of us maybe had tough breaks at a time when we didn't think we had time to redeem it. And I admit I'm speaking from my own ignorance, as I'm not yet in that place in life, I don't think. But to feel like you are past the age of having any chance to turn things around must be a very depressing thing. And so she tells them, it's more bitter for me than for you. Has life ever turned out not the way you hoped it was going to be? Naomi is not entirely wrong. There is nothing her daughters-in-law can do to help her, and she starts thinking that maybe the kinfolk in Israel will be more merciful. She's got extended family there. Maybe they'll be nicer since she's reduced to having to beg. And so she tells her two daughters-in-law to go home. You still have a chance. I'm going to return to Israel and beg, and maybe they'll be nice to me there because I've got nothing here anymore. And these two daughters-in-law, one I said is Orpah, one is Ruth, they have to make their decision, and each of them does, and they make different decisions. And it's really interesting because both decisions are justifiable. Orpah says, you know what, you're right. My best shot is to go and try to start over. And she goes ahead and she goes back to her family. And it fully makes sense. I don't think anyone reads this story and looks at Orpah and says, Orpah, you were so selfish. I don't know why you did that. I don't think anyone who knows the story would say that. But Ruth makes a different decision, and she decides to go a different route. And it's funny how the little decisions you make in life can change so much of your direction, your destiny, and where you end up. And that is the case with Ruth. She makes this decision right here that honestly some would have doubted and said was kind of questionable. But it changes the course of her life in a really fascinating way. And so we get to what I call the speech that Ruth gives to her mother-in-law that really changes the course of the book itself. So we are now down to verse 16. But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. And may the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." And after that speech, Naomi stops fighting it. Ruth has made her decision. We don't really know why. Why did she choose to follow Naomi? Why did she choose to go to a foreign land, back to Israel? Maybe this is a statement of faith. I mean, she says she believes. She says, "Your God will be my God." Maybe it's a statement of faith, or at least her faithfulness and loyalty to her mother-in-law. Maybe she didn't have as much to go back to. Maybe her family wasn't as caring or as loving, or maybe her parents were dead. We don't know exactly what led her to make this decision. Maybe she just had pity on an old woman. We don't know. But sometimes the only thing that you can do for someone who's hurting is to simply be there with them. This is something that I've learned throughout my ministry. It took a little while, but have you ever been around someone who's going through a painful time, like Naomi is going through this painful time, and you want so badly to come up with the right words to say to them, right? And you're racking your brain, and you're like, well, maybe I'll tell them that, God has another angel in heaven or something, right? And then they roll their eyes, and you wish you had just kept your mouth shut. Happens all the time. Sometimes when people ask to me how they can help, my best advice, honestly, if you're dealing with someone who's going through grief or hardship of some kind, honest to goodness, the best counseling advice I can give you is probably to shut your mouth. I hate to say it that way, but there's truth to it, okay? No one needs a cheesy, over-spiritualized explanation. They know what they're going through. What they really need is just someone to be close to them and go through it with them. Even I've been in the ministry 10 years now, and I went to school for way too long. I don't know the words that are going to fix their issue, because there are no words that are going to fix their issue. but the people in their lives who come alongside them are the best help they can get. So Ruth decides to go with Naomi back to Israel. And now the nature of this story is set in motion. The tragedy has happened, the decisions have been made, and the two of them, Ruth and Naomi, are heading back to Israel, where they will essentially beg. Now, for chapter 2, there's a few things you need to know about poverty in Israel. One of the things that's set forth in the Old Testament laws is that there should be some mercy on those who are in poverty. And one of the laws that's given is that when the farmers would go and farm their crops and harvest, that they were supposed to be careful not to go over it twice. If a few things get left behind, so be it. Let the poor come by and pick up the little leftovers and things. It also says don't harvest the corners of your fields, of the crops. Leave something for the poor to gather. And so one of the ways in which people survived is that seasonally, based on the crops that were available, they would go to a farm, follow behind the harvesters, and pick up what was left behind. And as you can imagine, it's nice that they set that up. It's nice that it's in the law, but it really kind of depends on the farmer as to how generous they're going to be and how much they allow you to gather. Because you can imagine that some people might not take real kindly. Here I am trying to harvest my crops, and there's someone behind me trying to pick up everything I leave behind. They might just run you off. It's a truly and honestly dangerous thing to do. And that's the situation that Ruth and Naomi are in. And so because this is the way you beg, Ruth, being the younger woman, decides, you know what, I'll be the one to go out in the field today, and I'll pick up the leftovers, and hopefully I'll find someone who's, nice about it. And Naomi says, okay. And so Ruth goes out, and she ends up in a particular field where it seems that God's providence is starting to come into play. We're now down to chapter 2, verse 2. Ruth the Moabite, remember, she's not even an Israelite. She's a foreigner. Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. Naomi said to her, go ahead, my daughter. And so she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to a guy named what? Boaz. Okay. If you know the story, you've heard this name before, Boaz. And it gives us a little point here. It says, who was from the clan of Elimelech. And who is Elimelech? Naomi's husband that has passed. Okay. So in other words, they're family. There's some connection, some relation. It's a little bit extended. They're just of the same clan, but they are related. And this becomes a very important point as things go on. However, now, all we need to know is that this Boaz shows quite a bit of kindness to Ruth as she is trying to follow behind the harvesters. Going down to verse 8. So Boaz says to Ruth, my daughter, listen to me. And basically, he sees this woman gathering along behind the workers, and he goes up to the workers and says, who is that? They tell him, oh, it's Ruth. She came with Naomi back from Moab, and they have this conversation. And so he goes up to Ruth, and then he says this, basically standing up for her. My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field. Don't go away from here at all. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. He's protecting her. Don't run this one off. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars that the men have filled. You can follow along. I'll tell them not to hurt you. You go get water whenever you want it. They won't stop you. He's helping her. He's defending her. He's being kind. At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner? In other words, she doesn't understand why he's being so nice. And that's a good question, because it wouldn't have been expected, It was kind of unusual, and so she asks, why? And his answer is very telling. Boaz replied, I have been told about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. In other words, he was impressed by her story. He knew what she had done, what she had taken on, and he decides to help. It even says this, verse 12, may the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Now, she says, may God bless you for what you have done. That's nice. But I also highlighted under whose wings you have come to take refuge because that line is important. There's a callback to it later on that you could easily miss. And so I want you to put a pin there in your head. Don't actually put a pin in your head. Like your thoughts. You know what I'm saying? I'm very articulate this morning. I want you to remember that line. It really is nice when our little bit of kindness comes back to us. It doesn't always work out that way, does it, right? Sometimes you do a kind thing and the world just stomps on you even worse. But in this case, Boaz takes notice of what she did. And he gives her protection. And more than that, we go later in the story, and so if you were to jump down to verse 14, you would see that he allows her to take her bread and dip it in the wine from his own table, which is extremely kind for someone who's begging, right? And he gives her that grace. And then you go a little bit further, and he tells his workers to leave behind full sheaves of the harvest behind for her to take. And she gets a whole bunch of them and takes them back. I mean, imagine her arms were full, right? It's like when I try and take the groceries out of the car and I'm not going back for the second load, you know, and you're just like covered in groceries. That's what she brought home that day. You guys didn't even laugh. Do any of you try and take it all in one load? Okay, all right, okay. I'm not the only one. And so she comes back to Naomi that night with all of these groceries from begging, mind you. And all of a sudden, this is the talk, like, what happened to you today? And it's funny because I've learned some things, and I've got a little bit of a story here. Have you ever noticed that when the possibility of romance exists, the girls talk about it and tell each other everything? I'm not trying to generalize here. I mean, I kind of am, but there's some truth to this one. You see, Jen and I, we met online. We actually did the eHarmony thing back when eHarmony was still Christian-ish. And eHarmony was this fascinating thing, and we did all these things. And, you know, that's how Jen and I ultimately met. But what I did not know for a while was just how involved her friend was in our entire getting together. What was that friend's name? Brianna. Okay. So I filled out the profile, and Brianna and Jen are both looking at all the possibilities of the men on the website, all the people that she's matched up with. And apparently, Brianna must have thought my profile was pretty cool, because she recommended to Jen to look at it. And so, you know, women talking about everything, the romance, the possibilities. And then I got a little more information, and I found out that they had looked at my things on the profile and looked at my height, and they had actually pulled out a tape measure against the wall, had Jen stand next to it, took pictures to decide whether or not it was even a possibility. Also, I listed myself as 5'5", and to this day, Jen believes I lied on that. And so they had all these conversations. Later on, our this is my fault, I kind of stopped responding for a little while. I was going through some other things, and Brianna suggested to Jen that there was a feature where you could nudge someone, or was it a poke or a nudge? What was it? I don't remember. And she did, and the timing was good, and I responded back, and the rest is history. And now I get to embarrass her in front of like 100 people every week. But when there's the possibility of romance, plans and conversations have to happen. And especially when it's two women, there's a lot of conversations to be had. Hopefully I didn't embarrass you too bad. That's our story, it's fun. But this is the case with Naomi and Ruth. And when Ruth comes home with all these groceries, Naomi notices something, and they talk about it. And so it's really, really fascinating. We're down to chapter 2, verse 19. Her mother-in-law asked, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. Look at all you brought home. This is unusual. What is going on here?" Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is, Boaz," she said. Well, this sparked an interest in Naomi's mind because she still has some memories of her clan and her background. So she says, "The Lord bless him." Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead," hinting that there's something more than just food that he can give. She added, "That man is our close relative. He is one of our," what's that word? "Guardian redeemers." Okay, so let's talk about what that means. So I told you earlier about the Levirate duty, right? That is a law in the Old Testament about a brother taking his dead brother's wife and continuing on the genealogy. But one thing that was more traditional and not necessarily talked about in Old Testament law is this idea that can extend beyond siblings. And so the idea is that someone else in the family could also extend not just genealogy, but also buy up land that was lost in order to keep it in the family. And so there's at least two functions. One is keeping the land in the family so that it doesn't go to foreigners, but keeping it close so that wealth and things that are tied to land can be there. And then also possibly the extra step of taking on the genealogy. Now, that would be called a guardian redeemer, someone willing to redeem the land and be guardian over the estate in order to keep it going. And this idea becomes very important because although Boaz could never do his Levirate duty, since he's not related to the family in that way, he could, through an extension, not by law, but out of his desire, play the role of guardian redeemer. And that becomes something in their mind. Now, keep in mind that this is not a law. He doesn't have to do it. It's simply an idea that could happen. Also remember that if you are looking in the Old Testament for moments in which you could find an image of Jesus, Boaz as guardian redeemer really fits the bill, doesn't he? Someone who saves us, rescues us, who continues us on from a place of spiritual destitution. Someone who comes in and redeems our life for something more valuable. That's part of the beauty of the story of Ruth, part of why Christians read it. But keep in mind that it hasn't happened yet. This is not a done deal. So far, all he's given are groceries. And I want you to notice a couple other things before we kind of read what happens, because I think this is important to notice. I think it's important to notice that the idea of a Jew and a Moabite getting together in Israel was, at least at some points in Israel's history, quite frowned upon. This is not an obvious this is going to happen thing. Okay, Ezra specifically commanded and he basically ridiculed Jews who made this very same decision much later, hundreds of years later. But you could see why that might not be a real popular thing. Now, she did say, your God will be my God, and so you could say it's a conversion and therefore okay. And I assume that is the gray area in which they are working. But I want you to know that just because that gray area is there, and just because she promised to be a Jew, doesn't necessarily change the hearts of everyone in town. So there's something rather tricky going on there. Marrying a Moabite is not obvious. Also, part of the story that is coming up would appear to be a little bit forward. There is nothing about this story that is the traditional way of doing romance. This is not two young people who met at a young age and then figured out life together. These are grown-up people. And their romance is somewhat non-traditional. And the story of how it happens is filled with vagueness and possibly euphemism. It's not clear exactly what happened, but I imagine that there were rumors. Meaning that nothing of this is easy. It's messy, which I think is kind of how her life is. And I think that's important because if we're going to relate to her, we need to understand this is not the picture-perfect way of doing Jewish romance. But with that in mind, let's go hear the plan. Naomi, being the experienced and seasoned one, says, I know how we're going to do this. And she lays out a plan. The wise woman. She says in chapter 3, verse 1. She says this, one day Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, my daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be well provided for. You don't need to be doing this forever, taking care of me. You need to have your own life and your own plan. And I need to make sure you have one, so let my wisdom work. Now, Boaz, whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours, and tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. In other words, he will be alone. And I have a plan for you that I want you to do this for me. Verse 3, wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor where Boaz is alone. But don't let him know that you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. And when he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. You know what? I said alone. I'm going to backtrack. I think I said that wrong. I think there were other workers. That's why she had to know where he was laying down. Sorry. Nonetheless, it is a conspicuous place. A woman should not be in the dorm rooms. You know what I mean? Well, at Bible college they couldn't. At other people's colleges, it was no big deal. I don't know. A woman is in the dorm room with the guys on their work. And something is questionable about all of this. So they set this up. It could be considered an act of seduction. It's hard to know exactly the intent, but I will say when it all comes into play, it's a request. See how it plays out. I'm going down to verse 8. In the middle of the night, she's done this now, okay. Something startled the man, that is Boaz. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. And I imagine he was a little startled. This was not what he expected to be happening that night, okay? And he looks down, and there's this woman lying next to him. Who are you? He asked. It must have been pretty dark. Who are you? I am your servant Ruth, she said. And then notice this line, spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family. What was it that he had said to her about God providing for her May God cover you with his wing and protect you. She shows up and says, you cover me with a blanket and take care of me. In some way, shape, or form, she is essentially requesting marriage. She proposed to him. Talk about non-traditional, right? And he has to decide whether or not to take up this duty that he is not required to do and welcome her and protect her as guardian redeemer. It's really a beautiful story. It's fascinating and interesting. So I don't want to only use sports metaphors, so I'm going to use a story from a chick flick. It's called Notting Hill. It's got Julia Roberts in it, right? Who is the guy in that one? Is it Hugh Grant? Is it Hugh Grant in Notting Hill? You guys are no help at all, okay? There's a line in the movie which Julia Roberts says, I'm just a girl standing in front of a boy asking him to love her. That's what I think of, okay? She's saying, spread your garment over me. I'm asking you to love me. She's essentially making the proposal. I don't even know why I bother to make this relevant, okay? I should have just gone on. I'm not a lover of chick flicks, okay? I just remember that line. Long story short, he agrees. But there's an order of business that needs to happen. It turns out there's one relative that's actually a little bit closer, blood-wise, than he is. And so he can't take up this duty without first talking to him and making an agreement. And so he does, the way things worked back then is they did all their business apparently at the town gates as people came in. And so the elders would gather early in the morning and go over the business. And so he gathers them there. He finds this guy that is a closer relative. And he says, hey, just so you would know, you are the closer relative to some land, and if you would like to buy that land as the guardian redeemer, you have first rights, but if you don't want to, I would like to do it. And so the guy thinks about it. He says, yeah, you know what? I don't mind buying some land. Yeah, sure, I'll do that. I'll buy up the land and save it and keep it in the family. He says, oh, by the way, the land comes with another wife. And the guy says, never mind. Sorry, that's what it says. And so long story short, we end up with a happy ending. This messy life ends up with, he gives the rights to Boaz to buy the land and also marry Ruth. And we get this happy ending. It's really unbelievable. This messy, tragic life ends with this beautiful ending in which Ruth, because of her faithfulness to her mother-in-law, ends up with an opportunity to marry and to have children herself. And the story goes on, and they give you your full happy ending and describe it. Down in chapter 4, verse 13, it says, so Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And when he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. Remember, that was the problem. They had no sons, no husbands, nothing left over. And notice the way that it's said. The women said to, not Ruth, but who? Naomi. The women said to Naomi, praise be to the Lord who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. We keep going a little bit. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age, because now she has family. For your daughter-in-law who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons has given him birth. First of all, I don't think it was necessary to say that she was better than 7 sons. Come on now. Sons are pretty good, okay? And I think that was a little bit rude. He's acknowledging the kindness of Boaz and the kindness of Ruth that have kept this woman, who, by the way, was in a bitter place, and given her hope again. Jumping down to 16. Then Naomi took the child in her arms. Remember, this is grandma. and cared for him. And the women living there said, Naomi has a son? Doesn't that seem odd to you? Not Ruth, no, Naomi has a son. In other words, she has hope again. She's a grandma. Every person I've ever talked to said that being a grandma is exactly as good as they tell you it is, or better. Is that right? I have kind of figured this out with my parents because all of a sudden they don't really show much interest in seeing Jen and I anymore. It's when is Macon coming, right? What is that about, okay? I used to be their favorite. Now I've got a blonde-headed 6-year-old that has become their favorite, and I want it back. But they're so excited because Naomi has a son. And they named him Obed, and he was the father of Jesse, who was the father of whom? David. There's your connection. You want to know how this connects to the big story? It connects because Ruth gets grafted into the family line. This foreigner, this Moabite, gets grafted into the line from which are descended kings. Because it turns out that she is, I think, great-grandmother to David. And it wouldn't make sense, it shouldn't be in there, and yet it is. This story connects to the big story because through this woman and her remarkable journey, she becomes grafted into the story of the birth of a king, whose story we'll be getting into very shortly. You see, I think more than anything that this is a book about hope. I think it's a book about hope because her life is messy. And remember who it was that was convinced that her future was going to be bitter? Who was that who said that? My destiny is bitter than yours. Naomi. And here she is celebrating at the end. In messy lives, happy endings do sometimes happen. And the biblical version of that is called hope. And I think that is what Ruth is all about. And by the way, not only was David descended through the story of Ruth, but who else in the New Testament is found to have a genealogy connected through Ruth? Jesus. That's how the bigger story comes into play. It hardly makes sense. You should not have a Moabite woman in a genealogy of male Israelites, but her name is given because she played that important role. So here's my application points, and I'll leave it at this. Obviously, the easiest one, go and read chapter 10 of the story. That's where we're going next week. But here's the one I really want to hold on to. Zealously defend your hope. There is something about this world that has this ability to beat down all of your hope that things will change or get better or go in a different direction. I think it is a tool of Satan to make you believe that it can't get better. It is that tool that keeps you from taking chances. It's that tool that keeps you from believing and having faith in a God who can do more than you can imagine or believe. It's that tool that keeps you in the doldrums and makes you not so useful for God. It is that telling you that it cannot happen, it won't happen, and stop having these wishful dreams that when you allow it to get to you, it pulls you down and keeps God from using you. It's a tool, it's a deceit, and it's a lie. Stop it. Instead, choose to zealously defend your hope. Am I saying that it will always turn out the way you want it to turn out? Not at all. What I am saying is that it might turn out better than you even imagined. And the story of Ruth proves that. Does God always choose to fix our situation? No. But sometimes he does. And sometimes those who really believe and choose kindness and faithfulness and loyalty over and over again, who have their hope in a God that is bigger than all, sometimes their story ends up being a part of the story of God's salvation for the world. So defend your hope at all costs. It is as important to you as breath itself. If you let that go away, you will lose so much more. Defend it, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. That is what faith does for the believer. And that's why we live our lives differently. Because our God can and does. Amen. Thank you, Lord, for loving us as much as you do. We give you praise and honor and ask that today you continue to fill us with hope. Because some of our stories are messy, but Lord, you are perfect. And in that, we know that you still work in our messy place. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.